Today we are with Mrs. Surani Punchihewa, registered migration consultant specializing in Australian visas and migration procedures, and she's been practicing for over a decade and has processed over thousands of visas. You've been in the business of visa consulting for many years, so let's talk about the different kinds of visas.
Yeah, we've been doing actually various types of visas where when it comes to immigration or even migration matters, obviously lots of visas are involved. That varies from tourist visas to student, and it could be a business visa, it could be a partner, it could be a parent visa. So it actually varies depending upon the objective of your visit to Australia. However, when you talk about migration, it's a different set of rules actually apply, because we're talking mostly about permanent visas here for people who are immigrating with their families and who want to make Australia their home. So when you look at the overall migration program, you're looking at about a quarter of 190,000 visas in a year. And this quota has been consistently increasing. When you look at 10 years ago to now, there's a sharp increase in the availability for migration. And when you look at the general quota, out of that, 68% of the visas are allocated for the skilled migration. We call the GSM visa, General Skill Migration. And what happens here is you would need, there are a set of rules, and you would need to qualify under those rules and requirements.
Okay, so how does one qualify for a skilled visa?
Okay, when you talk about skilled visas in general, there are few categories of visas. Now, I would be talking about few subclasses of visas. Now, when you take a visa, there's a class of visa, and then there are subclasses of visas. So mostly for people who are migrating into Australia on a permanent or a temporary visa under the GSM, we call the General Skill Migration stream, there are three main subclasses that apply. We call it the 189, that's the independent category. And then there's 190, which is the state-sponsored category. And there's a 489. This, again, is either a state or a relative-sponsored visa. So, first of all, you would need to identify and see which visa subclass that you would fit into. In doing that, preliminary, you would meet a set of criteria, which we call the basic criteria. And these are having your occupation in the gazetted list of occupations. We call the skilled occupation list, SOL, or there's another list called consolidated skilled occupation list, which we call the CSOL. So if you go to the DIBP website, you would find these two separate lists, and you would often confuse, where do I belong to which one? So basically speaking, if you wanted to qualify under the independent category, your occupation must be in the skilled occupation list, SOL. And if you are sorting after a state nominated visa with a state sponsorship, then your occupation must be in the CSOL. So this is the primary thing that you would need to identify. Having the occupation doesn't mean that you would meet the migration criteria. And obviously your age has to be between 18 and 50, so the repertoire is really large. And most likely people who are between the age of 18 to 45 will definitely meet the criteria if your occupation is on the list. And then the third criteria, the basic requirement, is your English. Your English has to be tested most often, and a certain amount of points have to be sorted out as the fourth criteria. So it's actually a point-tested migration program.
Okay, so you've talked about the point testing. Let's talk a little more extensively about the point test that's involved in skilled migration.
Right. So point test is the crucial or deciding factor in the migration program. And at this moment in time, the point stands at 60, and it actually varies. Some time ago, they had the point system and they looked at it in a different dimension, went into 130s, 120s like that. But that whole regime has now changed, and we're into the 60s in the points test ladder. Now, most recently, the point test was reduced, I must say, a few years ago, actually, from 65 to 60. So which actually means there is more demand within Australia, otherwise there wouldn't be a logical reason for anyone to reduce the points. So at this moment in time, this point stands at 60, and this could go either up or down, depending on the economic situation in Australia. So talking about the point tests, how one would get the 60 points that is required, there are primary factors. We talk about age. Let's say if you're between, the age is between 18 to 33, 18 to 25, you would get 25 points, and between 25 to 33, 30 points. So from there onwards, the points will start reducing, going from 25 then to 15. So that's a primary factor, and also a qualifying factor as well. And then comes to your qualifications. Now, most often the case is you would need to have a formal qualification to qualify with the points for the points test. So we're looking at a degree having 15 points, which is a bachelor's or a master's. And if you have a PhD, then that's 20 points. And if your qualification is a diploma, then you get 10 points. Now, just having a degree or a diploma doesn't make it qualified. It has to be a valid qualification within the Australian framework. We'll talk about it down the track. And the third way of getting points is that for your work experiences. And it is also put into 3 sets of groups. 5 points for 3 years of work experience, then 10 points for 5 years of work experience, then 15 points for 8 or more years of work experience. So having these basic 3 would potentially get you between 50 to 55. So how do you kind of get the other lacking points? It is a question of how much you can score in your IELTS test. Now, IELTS is just one test. There are various other tests that meet the requirements, and they were changed very recently. So if you take the IELTS as the basis, to qualify for migration, you need to have basically 6 in each band for everyone, but that does not get any points. To be able to score points, you need to have 7 in each band. All right, so that gets you 10 points. But if your English skills are superior and you could get 8, then you can have 20 points towards your total score. So with all that, by now you would have gotten definitely 55. And then where do the other 5 comes from? There are various ways. If you have a skilled spouse and we can assess that person, well, then there's a 5 points of contribution. Or if you have had Australian work experience at some point, another 5 or 10 points could be added. Then if you had studied physical in Australia, another 5 points comes in, and so forth. And the major factor or contributing factor into the points would be what we call a state government or state territorial government nomination. In that, if you are applying for a temporary visa, you get 10 points, a permanent 5. So the idea is to gather these points in various ways and means. And if you meet the 60-point criteria, you pretty much qualify for migration.
All right, thanks for clearing that up. And the next question we have is, you previously mentioned something about subclasses. You said that that is a requirement. So let's talk a little bit about the subclasses also.
Okay. There are 3 subclasses that I mentioned, which is the 189 for independent. Now, to qualify for independent, you will have to score 60 points on your own, without a territorial nomination being involved. So 60 points for 189 on your own, and then 190 if you only have the maximum amount of 55, and a state government in Australia has your occupation up for nomination, you can score either 5 or 10 points towards that. So that's subclass 190, and there's a subclass called 489. Now the difference between subclass 190 and the 489, they're both state sponsored. 489 actually can be linked into a Australian relative sponsorship as well. So 489 primarily is a temporary visa, where 190 is a permanent visa. So, I mean, if you, as the applicant, have the option of obviously getting a permanent visa, that's the way to go. But sometimes the points you may not meet the points, or your occupation is only in SOL, and then you have to combine with a relative to get those points, then that would be the only option. Then you would go for a 489. Now, you don't need to be afraid that 489 visa is a temporary visa, and I'm going to go to Australia on a temporary visa. It is actually constructed in such a way that once you meet criteria of living and working in Australia within 4 years, 2 years, so the 4 years is the visa period, and out of that, if you had lived and worked for 2 years, then it is pretty much a bridge to a permanent resident visa. So that's actually the difference between the subclasses.
All right. My next question is, what is the process involved in getting a skilled visa?
Okay, this can be complex, and it can be comprehensive as well. So you need to know exactly what you're doing, because what it means is if you fail at one point, because we're following up few steps in order to get the visa. It's not a matter of filling an application and lodging the visa. It's very important that you get this right from the inception. So what we generally do is we work backwards. We look at the visa criteria. Meeting those visa criteria, we come to the initial stage where we start lodging a skills assessment. So anyone who is going under the GSM program under subclass 189, 190 and 489 that I mentioned, your skills must be assessed by one of the relevant assessing authorities. So each occupation will have their own specified authority. So what it means is you need to, first of all, meet the criteria set by that authority for us to get a positive skills assessment. And this could be, in certain occupations, it could be very straightforward, but certain occupations, it can never be understood what these criteria mean and how you would get a positive assessment. So that's when probably you need some assistance from someone who has had dealt with these applications, and over the years with that experience you can obviously work better than an individual doing it for the very first time. So the initial process has to be nailed. If it does get knocked off, then that's the end of the total process, because reapplying into an assessment authority to get your qualifications looked at, you may need to wait some time if it doesn't succeed at the initial steps. So you're talking about an opportunity loss here. And coming into the second part of the process, we look at an expression of interest. This is an electronic application that is lodged to the Department of Immigration. And with that, sometimes, or most of the times nowadays, we lodge something called a state territorial nomination. And this is actually not essential for everyone, lodging a state nomination, but EOI is an essential part of the process. So what the EOI does is it sees whether you have the points met before an invitation is made through the Department of Immigration and Border Protection in Australia. And once the third step or the final step of the process is once an invitation arrives, that means pretty much it's all cleared, you can actually proceed with a visa application. And basic criteria are met. A lot of the difficult parts of the process has been now concluded, but then another comprehensive assessment will follow at the visa level where actual human intervention comes in. A case officer would physically look at a file. Have you met all these criteria? Although you have got an assessment, you've done the IELTS, whether they're genuine, the legitimacy of everything would be checked through, and obviously in the final stage of the process. Currently, the Department of Immigration processes visas very quickly. I'm talking about 2 to 3 months of time frame, and this has changed over the years. From 4 or 5 years ago, it used to be pretty much 2-3 years of a process, and the Australian government has been really thinking about the actual necessity of bringing in a migrant and the potential of employment, and it makes a lot of sense to process a visa quicker, because by the time 2-3 years passes, the demand wouldn't actually exist. So the mechanisms have changed, and they have done a marvelous shift in the total process, which actually is very convenient for the applicants as well as representatives like us to be able to give an indication of the potential possibility of process and the processing time.
Okay, so you mentioned that it was useful if someone who knew the process was there to help you with it. So that's where my next question comes from. How does the Australian Migration Centre assist an applicant within this process?
All right, first of all, just to give you a quick idea, our company, Australian Migration Centre, has been there for a decade or so, and then we have a couple of consultants working for the company. The most important factor here is for an applicant to see whether your consultant is registered through the Migration Agents Registration Authority, where actually it is Migration Registration Authority is under Department of Immigration and Border Protection. So this is a vital factor. Our registrations are annually renewed. So what it means is our knowledge in the legal area of immigration is updated. And also not only the knowledge of the legal area, but our practicing in general is being evaluated annually. So it's always better to go with an agent who has this registration with the Department of Immigration, the Migration Agents Authority. And you can be rest assured that your application will be looked after a person that has current immigration practice. Now, coming back to the question of Australian Migration Centre, how we can help is we actually assist applicants from the beginning to the very end. This is to do with the visa process. So starting from the skill assessment to the lodgement of the assessments and the EOIs, the nominations, and finally the visa until you get the visa into your hands.
Until you get to go there and start anew.
Absolutely. So that will be the start of your new journey.